Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us around the world. My name is Sandra Carvão, and it's great to welcome you to another episode of the UNWTO Insights series. It is an initiative that we've started from the Market Intelligence Department at UNWTO, where every month we try to bring light into what data can give us in terms of helping us recover, knowing better our consumers, and plan ahead, hopefully to restart travel very, very soon. Couple of housekeeping announcements before we get into the presentations. We'll be very happy to get your questions, comments within those who are joining us through Zoom. The question and answer button down in your Zoom screen, and all the colleagues also joining us live in YouTube, please feel free that your questions will also reach us, and we'll make sure that we'll try to answer them all. We have people from all around the world joining us today. Good evening, Bhutan, I suppose, at this hours. Good to see you around, and good to see all the colleagues that join us from the different regions as well. As you've seen in the introduction, today's session is very much geared to understanding some of the data that are emerging in terms of consumer trends, but also to give you a little bit of a background of where we are in terms of the impact of tourism. So if you allow me, I will share my screen with you just to give you a brief overview of the latest international tourist arrivals. 2020, and this is something that we all have heard over and over, has been the worst year for our sector. But I would like to put some numbers into that magnitude of the impact. UNWTO latest figures indicate that we have lost around 73% of international tourist arrivals last year. Different regions felt it in a different way, although for the first time in history, we've actually seen that the impact has been felt in all the regions of the world. If you look at the graph that is showing on your screen, you can see that, for example, in Asia Pacific, the decline in tourist arrivals last year was over 80%. So above the world average, because Asia still continues to be today one of the closest regions in terms of border restrictions. We also see that, for example, Europe, who had a recovery during the summer months as opposed to the 70% decline, around the same as the Americas, Middle East and Africa, a little bit more impacted. Just to give you an idea of where this falls into the history of international tourism, as you can see in the graph, international tourist arrivals had been impacted by different crises in the past, either SARS or the global economic crisis of 2009. And actually, if you compare those impacts with COVID-19, it's something of a magnitude that we never saw. In 2003, international tourism declined by less than 1% and by 4% in 2009 under the impact of the global economic crisis. 2020 brought us, unfortunately, a decline that went beyond the 70%. If we look further into what this means, we can think of the impact in terms of volume as well. We were back into 1990 levels, so we've lost around 30 years in terms of international tourism flows. In terms of the impact economically, UNWTO estimates that the exports that are generated by international tourism, which are key to many countries' balance of payments, have reached a loss of 1.3 trillion. And if we look beyond into the overall impact of tourism in global GDP, that has probably reached over 2.5 trillion. But more importantly, it's all the jobs that continue to be at risk as many countries continue to face the impacts of COVID on travel and tourism. UNWTO estimates that 100 to 120 million jobs are actually impacted directly by this crisis. So obviously the vaccination in the beginning of the year has opened new opportunities. We have heard also that European countries are advancing a green passport to facilitate the reopening of travel during the summer. And what does this mean if we're looking ahead? So if we look at the facts, in February, beginning of this year, UNWTO tracking of the impact of travel restrictions shows us that around 32% of all destinations worldwide have completely closed their borders. What does this mean if we look back into 2020? It means that we all have seen how the outbreaks that are emerging newly and also the new variants have actually led to new measures of closure of borders, also of new measures of lockdowns in many countries, which means that with the current restrictions in place, among the top 10 source markets, around 44% of global travel would have been impacted or totally closed. This means also reinforcing what UNWTO had initially foreseen as scenarios, that we will take at least 2.5 to 4 years to actually go back to previous levels. We have also consulted our UNWTO panel of experts, which is made of over 100 experts around the world. And what they told us is that they do not expect the levels of 2019 to be actually there before 2023 or 2024. As you can see, less than 20% actually expected those levels to be seen next year. We are also releasing very soon our new results for this year, and I can tell you in almost under embargo that we unfortunately have seen that January has confirmed the worsening of the data that we have seen towards the end of 2020 already. International tourist arrivals will be down for over 80% in the month of January. And then fortunately, some of the challenges with the vaccination rollout that we are observing are also having impact in the current measures. Also, the fact that many countries have reimposed travel restrictions at the end of the year and that continue to be in place now have actually taken us to a situation where our expected rebound will hopefully come in July. But even in that situation, we really need to step up coordination to ensure that that happens. We are now very close to April, and the months from now to summer in the Northern Hemisphere, which represents a very big part of travel demand, are very, very close. So what has changed as well in terms of consumers? Those are just some highlights of all the research that has been done. And we will dwell into this issue with our special guest of today. But I'd just like to share a few trends that we have seen coming. Obviously, domestic tourism is showing positive signs in many markets, particularly because there is lockdowns relative to international travel. But there is that pent-up demand. So whenever there is a possibility of traveling domestically, the market is reacting, and we will probably see that in many of the data that we have access to. Also, that people have a preference for nature, rural tourism, and road trips, which are growing in many demand areas. Also, the importance of healthy and safety measures. And here I would stress the importance of communicating about them to make sure that we all contribute to increase consumer confidence, and obviously also an increase in last minute due to the fact that any planning is very connected to travel restrictions. It's really the major factor impacting on decisions, which means that people will wait as much as they can. We're also seeing that younger travelers have been more resilient, a change in demographics that we have observed during this COVID times, which we will see how we will see that change really staying afterwards or not. And also a desire to look into authentic experiences, local wood, which is really facilitated by the fact that many of the travelers are staying around their local houses. So with that, I'd just like to give you a brief update of where we are in terms of international tourism and the impact of COVID. just to summarize important points, vaccination rollout, definitely a big opportunity, but it needs to be stepped up, and it needs to include an increasing coordination among countries to ensure that protocols in place are coordinated and that companies and businesses can actually plan ahead, and that consumers feel that confidence to book, because the desire is there, but unfortunately travel restrictions are still the most important limitation to the restart of tourism. So with us today to share a little bit more about what we are actually seeing, what our consumers telling us directly with their searches and with their bookings, we have the pleasure of having Andy van der Velds with us. Andy is the Senior Director of Business Development at Expedia Group Media Solutions. Andy, very welcome to the UNWTO Insights series, and the floor is yours to share with us your insights.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for inviting me and for everyone to come and listen to this. And thank you for your presentation as well, which I made a couple of notes there. Incredibly that the numbers of travelers are now at the levels of early 90s, which is in fact when I started when I started in the travel industry. So it's almost Groundhog Day, and it's also good news that it won't take quite as long to get back to the levels of 2019, albeit still for all of us, I think, quite a long road back over the next 2 to 3 years. Let me share my presentation so that, and please let me know if you can see it and when you can see it.
Yes, we can see it. If you just want to put it in, perfect. Now it's full screen.
You have it. Okay, so thank you very much again. What I'm going to do in the next sort of 15-20 minutes is give an overview of 2 sets of data, effectively. One, which is first-party data, so what we're seeing on our platforms. That's quite a 2-dimensional set of data, if you like. It's what customers or travelers are doing. So their actions, search, booking as such, comparisons, movement around our sites. That gives a very good indication already in terms of providing insights to our partners in terms of helping them make their strategies, but it doesn't always give the full picture in terms of why the decisions are being made. So every year we also undertake independent research, and this one I'm presenting today was done together with North Star Research Partners, which then looks a little bit more at the sentiment behind the decisions. So understanding a little bit behind the why decisions are made, and then we couple that with our own first-party data to get a better holistic picture in terms of the decisions that are being taken and why those decisions are being taken. And that helps us create our own strategies, and certainly in these current times, but also our partners that we work closely with. And as you can imagine, these are thousands of partners around the globe who work with us, who want to engage with our visitors to our site. I mentioned that as a quick introduction, I'm going to try and remove this bar. I don't know if you guys can see it, but there we go. I've spent the last 20 odd years now trying to catch up on what it is, about 27 years working in the travel industry. The first 22 years was with Scottish Tour Board, now known as Visit Scotland, followed by the Netherlands Board of Tourism and Conventions in different roles, but always in the international marketing sphere. So a very solid background in DMO, destination marketing and promotion, albeit that obviously for a lot of destinations that is now evolving even faster than before from a destination promotion agency to destination management, where obviously this has accelerated that decision for a lot of DMOs. And then for the last years working with Expedia in the department, which is Expedia Media Solutions. And I will explain a little bit about that. So we are effectively the digital advertising arm of the Expedia group, connecting, if you like, those millions of travelers who are searching on our sites with our partners within the travel industry, whether that's destination management organizations, airlines, hotels, you name it. We're working with all these partners in order to engage them with our shoppers coming to our sites globally. That, you can imagine, leaves a lot of data behind. And obviously today's conversation is about data. And in fact, we have around about 300 petabytes. It's a new word on me, petabytes of data. that we collect. It's first-party data that belongs to Expedia Group. And just to give it some reference, some context, if you were to add up all the words written in every single language since the dawn of time, this would equate to 50 petabytes. So just to give you some context of the amount of data that we have at our disposal, I think you'll be all glad to hear that I will not be sharing all of that data today because it will take a while, but some of those cuts of data, obviously what we keen to share and to show you. But it just also underpins to our partners as well. It's like, depending on your question, and what I'm presenting today is also very much from a global perspective. And if you want to go deeper on your own regions or cities or countries, for that matter, we're able to do that for you as well. It just means cutting the data slightly differently. So I'm giving a more of a holistic picture today to give that flavor, but obviously there are variances by region and by country, of course. If we start with from a perspective, and it's very much in line with what you were presenting, Sandra, earlier on, is 2020 was at best a very volatile year, as you can see from this particular graph. These are the searches that were made on our platforms around the world. Now you have different colors here just to orientate you. You have, if I can see that, because I've got now my own picture in the way. You have in yellow, or orangey yellow, is North America. In the teal, which is that blue sharp color, is the APAC region. The white is EMEA, and the dark orange is LATAM. So you can see here there are variances there, but overall it's been a hugely fluctuating year in terms of those searches. And if you were to map this against the outbreaks of COVID at the beginning, and also as you get towards December of last year, when the announcements of the vaccination programs were rolling out, you see these spikes coming up on in all regions, predominantly in terms of the search patterns from consumers looking for vacations. So this is all about the consumer behavior on our site. And then again, as you have a natural seasonality in there as well, as things drop off towards the end of the year. It then picked up again when, for example, in the UK, Boris Johnson put his roadmap out of the pandemic out. You also see a spike in the searches. But not only do we see spikes in searches, but we also see spikes in bookings. And that's a fundamentally important thing to point out here, is that bookings are still happening and people are still traveling, albeit, as we've seen earlier on in Sandra's presentation, a lot less than before, which means there is still very much an audience that's out there looking to travel, and when they can travel, they will travel. And really what it is government restrictions that are holding their travel patterns back. And not only in terms of travel patterns, but government restrictions also go into how destinations actively promote themselves. So although a lot of destinations may wish to promote themselves at the moment, very often it's being down to governmental restrictions that they aren't able to get out into the marketplace. But bottom line is there is an active seeking audience out there looking to travel, as the search patterns here indicate. You mentioned the sort of the opportunistic traveler in terms of the shorter booking window, and our own data reflects this as well. As you can see here, the majority in that yellow is the 0 to 21 days, so a very short booking window. You can see that pretty much from at the start of the pandemic, there was a little bit of confusion, a bit of movement in terms of the windows, but very soon towards the back end of April, early May, you can see a very sharp, steep rise in the 0 to 21 day booking window people were looking at in terms of prior to their trip itself. And that has remained fairly constant throughout, with, again, sharp inclines as vaccinations were announced, people eager to get and book their trips, tailing off again seasonally, and then picking up again with some slight variations by region towards February and March. So that's been the dominant thing, very much the 0 to 21 days, because of that uncertainty in terms of when destinations would be open or not. So, that decision-making process has become far shorter. Interestingly, though, we are seeing on our own sites a movement, and that's very light. You can see here in the teal color, which is a 22 to 30 day one, and also the orange right at the bottom, which is a 61 to 90 days. Now, if you go into different parts of the world and the data from different parts of the world, you'll see this accentuated more in other places then, for example, as you pointed out as well, Sandra, with the Asia or APAC region, which has been in the strongest lockdown possible, that's slightly less accentuated, but certainly in North America, in EMEA, you see that as a much steeper growth of people now booking and looking at sort of 180 days outwards. So there is movement in that whole aspect of the booking window, and it's incredibly important as well when you're creating a strategy is to be aware of what the latest is, and this does change on a daily basis, you can imagine. Going through to the next one is, what are they searching for? And there's been that whole mix of domestic as international, and this also again fluctuating. All the partners that we talk to, and Sandra, you mentioned as well, is domestic is very much the moment is right now for domestic. It has been for the last 6 months and 9 months, where most destinations and the travel industry with them have turned to domestic audience, and some regions of the world that's been stronger than others or more sustainable than others. But that doesn't mean that the international search hasn't been there. And you can see here in the teal color, the green-blue color, again, you can see that the searches for international have been oscillating along with domestic. Although the bookings as such haven't been done on international, they have been obviously on a domestic, but the search, incredibly importantly, is there, and that search window, as I mentioned, is for that 180 days and longer. So they are wanting to travel internationally. They're searching for international travel. They're just not able to right now. But as soon as they are able to, I can guarantee you that they will be making those bookings, and you'll see a movement in terms of that international search. And if you look at 2 or 3 countries in Europe, for example, which we've been tracking since the beginning, France, Germany, and the UK as examples. If you look at towards the beginning of the summer last year, there was a good mix of international and domestic, international being within Europe in this case, as people were traveling within Europe in that part of the year, closed obviously for Q3 and Q4, where you suddenly saw this amazing swing from no international searches, effectively almost at 90-odd% in terms of domestic searches, only for that to creep up again as soon as the announcements were made around the vaccination programs and the roadmaps out of lockdown. And then you suddenly start seeing an increase again in that international search with the reduction of domestic. But to the point of you made earlier on, Sandra, domestic is still very much at the key stage right now. Another part of the research that we carry out is an intercept research on our own sites, which we carried out since April last year. And that's really effectively, asking people who are coming to what their purpose is of being on that site in a very pleasant way, of course, as you can imagine. But that has provided us with a huge amount of data in terms of understanding their process or their mindset once they're on our sites. And you can see here at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a much larger percentage of people canceling, changing their bookings, checking the status of their bookings towards, you can see that tailing off very much towards where we are today in sort of February, March of 21. The one thing I want to point out, or two in fact, is that growth in shopping, and that's the yellow one. So right at the beginning, so people are shopping, and then there's that stable shopping pattern from around about the summer last year as people continue to come to our platform, not just to search, but also to book. But for me, the most important one, and the one which we've been trying to get across to our destination partners in particular, is the consumers have, and we are all consumers and we are all doing it, is that have never stopped dreaming about the travel. So they are still on our sites looking for ideas, searching for ideas, making comparisons for trips. And it's almost that feeling of, when we travel, where will we go? And it's that what you can see in this light blue bar, right? Even from the beginning of the pandemic, it really never tailed off. It's slightly moved here and there, but it's so incredibly important to understand that people are dreaming and coming to our sites to get that inspiration. And effectively, as we go through the pandemic, understandably, a lot of destinations, a lot of partners removed marketing efforts. But to my mind, and I think to many people's minds, it's a wasted opportunity when there are consumers who are actually actively still searching, whether they can go or not. They are still wanting to take on content, and that content effectively was removed from them in terms of destinations or partners who didn't at that point find it the right strategy in order to be speaking to them, whether it's about dreaming or otherwise. But it's an audience that was there very much taking that dream, and that continues to be an audience as we go to into March and further this year as well. So incredibly important aspect to understand. As I mentioned earlier on, we have third-party research to understand a little bit more about the sentiment behind these decisions. And this was carried out in 11 countries, so 11,000, roughly speaking, respondents to this research, which was carried out at the back end of last year. In fact, it was only done a couple of weeks prior to the vaccination announcement. So a lot of the findings in this have only been further strengthened by the vaccination program rollout as such. But just to start it off, you know, in 2020, 6 in 10, so 60% of travelers around the world gave up their trip. So they had to cancel their trip. So effectively 33%, give or take, did go on a trip, and predominantly domestic. But that's a huge amount. And you can imagine that is just sort of bottled up, pent up demand for travel. And in other research that we have, that's translating itself into consumers thinking about taking multiple trips when they can in 2021, whether that is domestic or international for that matter. But the bottom line here is it's very much creating this pent-up demand, with 60% having had to give up those trips. Of those 33% that did travel, 80% did so for rejuvenation, a change of scenery, whether it's the weather, or visiting friends and family. It was there to just recharge our batteries. And I think we can all agree that we are reached certain points in our energy levels when it comes to, you know, being in lockdown, restricted in our movements, not just in terms of personal, but also from a professional point of view. So people, very much those who did travel, were doing that to rejuvenate themselves and get that energy back. And that's a theme that we will continue to see, certainly going into 2021 and beyond, that people are just looking for that that moment to recharge their batteries effectively. Interestingly as well, when we asked this question around the world, it's like 50% feel optimistic. And again, it's important to understand this was done prior to the vaccine rollout. So even without the vaccine rollout being announced, 50% were optimistic about taking a trip in 2021. Which is, you know, a strong indication that there is this pent-up demand, and also an opportunity for us as marketeers, all of us, to convince the other 50%, and I'm sure many of those are now within this group as well, since the vaccine rollout had been announced, to get them to travel, to get them to be optimistic and inspired. The word here, reassurance, and Sandra, you mentioned it, you know, it's this whole bit about bringing back confidence and trust into the industry. I think this is certainly super necessary in order to get travelers to feel comfortable about traveling in 2021 and beyond. When they're asked in terms of, you know, when would it be likely that they would be traveling, there are some nuances here and difference by region, and understandably, again, because of the different lockdowns and also the different stages of the pandemic within their own regions. You can see that in these ones, the orange yellowy line, which is Latin America, and the red APAC, seem to be thinking that they will be traveling a lot sooner than other parts. Now, that may be intra-regional, but they have a much more optimistic outlook in terms of when they will be traveling next on a vacation. When you look at North America, it's really about end of Q1. And if you look at the acceleration on the vaccine program that they have going, that is very much also what we're seeing in our own trends on our first party data in terms of that search demand coming back. And then the green, which is EMEA, is, and we've all been there, and myself living in the UK, we see that obviously taking a little bit longer, and that optimism is more towards the back end of 2021, sort of Q2, Q3, Q4, where they really do see that acceleration in terms of taking that trip at that point, but very cautious still in the first 2 quarters of this year. So there are variances in terms of when they are planning to travel, but travel they will and travel they must. It's just a matter of time. When we started asking questions in terms of, okay, what aspects of the travel they need to feel more comfortable and supported around. 60% said they'd be more comfortable traveling by air, as an example, if there was social distancing measures in place. And I think a huge majority of the population feel this way, that, you know, as long as there is good social distancing in place, they feel that much more comfortable about traveling. And again, pointing out that this is pre-vaccine rollout. But again, super important to get this across. And Sandra, you mentioned earlier, is that messaging coming across towards the consumers is so fundamentally important, to make them feel comfortable, and to see it as well is also in imagery is incredibly important. Mask enforcement is also very much a leading factor for future accommodation transportation decisions. And you can see here slight differences in the percentages: 40% for accommodation, 50% on transportation. And it's that enforcement that they're looking for. Again, there are variances around the world, and this is in broad terms in line with how their own countries or regions have tackled the pandemic. So if you look at Brazil, for example, there is 2/3, 60-odd%, feel that mask enforcement is incredibly crucial and a leading factor in the decision-making process. Whereas in Australia, who have arguably tackled the pandemic quicker and more efficiently at the beginning, and certainly seen that bottled within and managed to a greater extent, only 30% of them feel that mask enforcement is important. So again, it's important here to understand who your audience is and what level of understanding and confidence they have in terms of the management of the pandemic. And therefore that also translates itself in terms of their expectations of what they would like to see from the different providers within the travel industry. And again, it's getting that message across to them. And then when we look at accommodation, almost 80% are making decisions around accommodation based on pandemic measures in place: hygiene protocol, the occupancy rate within a hotel, also the contactless, as example, contactless payment system. So it's all these aspects that they take into consideration when making choices for accommodation. It's important to understand this, not just to know it, but also to act on it and have the industry work on that to get that message across. Because obviously, if they don't know it and they are searching, then they have to make the assumptions that it isn't there. And therefore, reviews, customer reviews are incredibly important as well, as they start taking on board that information to make a judged decision on an accommodation provider on that basis. And then next to obviously the health is the financial peace of mind is also an incredibly important thing with this audience when they were surveyed. So understandably, you know, going through the pandemic and the whole period at the beginning when people were looking to cancel, so that the whole word, an overused word probably right now, this flexibility is so important. But also the understanding that they can get a full refund on accommodation and transportation if they are cancelled, and whether they're covered by trip insurance or trip protection is also incredibly important as we go into the comeback, if you like, of travel and tourism. So this hygiene combined with also the financial peace of mind are the two main factors really in terms of helping them make those decisions as to where, when, and where to and how to get to a destination. How, in terms of mode of transport, again, here we've seen some changes throughout the pandemic. So if you look at car, and Sandra, you mentioned road trips, yes, it's very much how people have been getting around, staying in, to a great extent, also in types of self-catering properties. But car, pre-pandemic, has maintained also during its pandemic, and you see a slight tail off of post-pandemic as people, as I mentioned earlier, are prepared to obviously get back into planes, which you can see here, obviously trains and buses and planes, who saw a huge reduction obviously during the pandemic, but bouncing, and you can see that in the light green bars, the bounce back for these different types of modes of transportation going into 2021. So the big bounces here are really around the air travel vertical, But also, I don't want to leave out cruise here, which has, seen a huge bounce back as well. People who like to cruise have come back and they want to cruise again. So from that perspective, we can see a good, strong bounce in terms of people's returning to other trusted forms of transportation. Likewise, when you look at accommodation, it's been much reported that obviously throughout the pandemic, the likes of our VRBO, the sort of vacation rental properties, have done well, as people who were traveling were staying in these types of properties with their families or otherwise. But as we look post-pandemic, that optimism towards going towards other types of trusted accommodation, hotels and resorts in particular, you can see that bouncing quite strongly back. And to the point here is, it's not to the detriment of vacation rental, but it's the total return of traffic and travelers' intent to come. So the audience has become bigger, and therefore there's that growth on pretty much all of those verticals going forward. I touched on these already earlier on, but I just wanted to make it one more time quite clear that it's all about that messaging. So understanding that, in this case, proper pandemic hygiene protocols are in place, mask use and enforcement is being done, and then understanding how important that is to an audience and its place therein. The fact that from accommodation, reduced capacity is an important message to get across. Contactless, as I say, room service and takeout, and then obviously contactless check-in. So it's understanding that these things are important, but then getting that message obviously out to that audience, and then understanding what the booking window is like, and then which regions are moving and who within those regions. You mentioned a little bit earlier on, Sandra, as well, in terms of the audience, and we also see that the younger generations are the ones, the first footers, if you like, who will be making that step, but then also not forgetting the older generations who also are at the cusp of making those travel plans. From a question, which is where are they getting, the travelers getting their source of information and inspiration? There are these three stats, which I find quite interesting as well, is that actually 24% are more likely post-pandemic to go to online travel agencies to get that inspiration and ideas for travel. 20% higher people, in terms of more people are going to DMO sites to get information, and incredibly 16% are getting inspiration from online travel advertising as well. So sort of, if you like, consumers are going to the online environment in order to get more and more to get their inspiration right now, latest information, latest developments about the trips that they are planning to make in 2021. So with that, I know I've been a little bit over my 15-20 minutes, hopefully not too much, but just as key takeaways, really the messaging around here is, put it in place is that people are looking to rejuvenate themselves, to recharge their batteries. That is really the main driver that we've been seeing come out of the sentiment. Hygiene and flexibility are crucial, and it's important to get that message across. And it's all about that reassurance, that content, so they can see it, they can take on board that content, whether it's written word or visual if you're from a younger generation, but incredibly important to get that confidence and trust back out there, especially as the corridors start opening up. That is my presentation, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you for that insightful sharing, and particularly I think the key takeaways at the end are critical, as you were speaking about communicating the enforcement of mask using and other safety measures. I was remembering a conversation with an hotelier in one island here in Spain who told me that a lot of their clients were more worried about the other clients of the hotel than about the protocols put in place by the hotel. I think that really shows how important it is that the perception of a safe environment is taken on board, not only by the accommodation provider, but also by the destination. And I think in that sense, DMOs have a key role to play to communicate that, but also to make sure that the enforcement happens, because then social media takes over, and your image of not enforcing the rules is all over very soon. I'm highlighting some of the issues also that Handy has mentioned. Definitely the short-term window. I think for everyone that's with us, this is a critical capacity to be flexible in terms of communication, to take advantage of that short-term window. Good to know the dream is there, so people keep searching at a very, very high level. As you saw, the level of searches is quite high when you compare to the previous pandemic as well. Also interesting for me, and I think it confirms what we are seeing in other data sources, is that Latin America and North America seem to probably be the regions that will somehow show some earlier rebound, probably together with the EU, if the Northern Hemisphere situation in terms of traveling improves. But I think it's very interesting to see that confidence in those markets. And also, one last point, and I think Andy mentioned it as well, is the importance that we see bounce back in air travel, and particularly in cruises, which in many parts of the world are still not operating. But I think it's very critical to know, as Andy was saying, there's a segment of the population who is very fond of cruise, and probably when the conditions and the legislation allows for it again, those people will return to the market. And a last point for me, which was also very interesting, and a point for the DMOs, was the fact that 20% more people go to the DMO sites to actually get information for their planning. I think this is very important for the DMOs to make sure that the information is relevant, particularly I think the issue of travel restrictions, because we know that people look for the official source to know if they can go, what's in place, what's not in place. So for those of DMOs and NTOs with us today in the ministries, it's important to make sure that everything related to the travel restrictions and all the enforcements that are in place in your destination are easily found in your website, but also, as Andy said, that you have other content to keep the dream alive. So with that, I will just reinforce the open now for questions. Please use those who are joining us in Zoom, the chat function, Q&A, sorry, not the chat, the Q&A function down in the Zoom. And for those on YouTube as well, your questions will be coming our way. So the first question that comes is, I'm just going to read from a participant here with us in Zoom that says that previous reports in the media mentioned that tourists are more confident in booking through agents post-pandemic. However, in your findings, I think, Andy, that's for you, it is indicated that tourists are now towards online bookings. What are the contributing factors to that change of behavior?
If I understand the question correctly, I think the behavior in terms of people going onto OTA sites becoming more, and we saw that with obviously that 24% lift since the pre-pandemic, is it's also it's an element of this confidence aspect, right? So a lot of the OTAs, including Expedia, really after the pandemic and dealing with the fallout of the pandemic, moved towards that providing the consumers with that confidence around making a booking. So that's that flexibility, which is, as I say, is an overused word, but it's very much there. So it's, you know, that knowledge that actually there's that cancellation policies in place, or I can change my booking. And we saw this over the summer last year. If you look at Europe in particular, where, you know, 1 minute there's a country which is on the green lane, it was known at that time, and then suddenly Spain, for example, and then suddenly it's on the red zone. And therefore people were able to change their plans, and then in a lot of instances moving and taking holidays in Portugal instead. So that flexibility and knowledge is incredibly important, and they know they can get that on an OTA, because an OTA has obviously got all that protection around that. So I think that plays an incredibly important part in the decision-making process that consumers are now making, rather than perhaps doing it all themselves and directly, indirectly packaging it themselves. Just knowing that confidence and that protection is in place.
Thank you, Andy. I think that's a very good point. Connected to that as well, there's another question on what we were mentioning about sources of information. We have seen that post-pandemic online agencies, DMO sites, is there any source that you see going down in terms of looking for information?
Sorry, Sandra, you dropped away a little bit there. Sorry.
Sorry. I was just asking if among the sources of information, is there any source that you see losing importance in terms of consumers?
Well, no. I think from a point of view of source of information, all the sources that we utilize have their benefits to us. It's just about the scope and size. So the intercept survey that we do gives an indication of why they're on our site. The sentiment analysis really goes in terms of understanding those motivations behind the decisions, and then our own first-party data, heavy data in terms of the decisions, actually in terms of search and bookings. That combination of sources provides us with a strong picture. What I would say is that certainly around sentiment, it's in the past you could use a piece of research and that would be good for 6 months, or even a year. I think the research that we pool nowadays is as good as the moment you're in. So sentiment changes incredibly quickly, as do decisions, and that's why we utilize, and that's from our perspective, is not always backwards looking data. We have the ability to do that forward looking data. So we can see, and that's why my comments are, that international search and book is a very real thing. And if you break that down by different regions, what we can actually see is decisions being made today, tomorrow, for travel 6 months out. So we can see this trend, and then tomorrow's trend may not look the same as yesterday's trend. And that's where that becomes more useful in terms of trying to predict what's going to happen, rather than based on historical data, because that is what it was, and it's changing so rapidly, as you know, that the only real way to get some sort of grip on it is to look at that forward-looking data, which obviously as an e-commerce platform, as well as a sort of a publisher, if you like, we're able to see that combination. So I wouldn't say that there's any source that's less useful. I would say there are sources which are more useful in today's terms, and it's certainly those that are actually forward-looking rather than just historical data looking, because I think people realize where we've come from and the situations that we've been in, but they don't necessarily know what to expect on how, or more importantly, how they can actually change the direction of a decision-making process. And that goes back to my point at the beginning, which is, I understand, and we all understand that DMOs have to make decisions as to when to step into the fray and start to communicate with these audiences. But I can also say that those that have worked with us in this period have obviously gained great return on that spend, because they are speaking to an audience that wants to travel. And if that window of opportunity is there, they're taking it, and they're not waiting until the sluice gates are open and that flood of demand comes in, because by that point, the amount of noise in the industry is going to be substantial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very key point. And I think from the beginning of the pandemic, the challenge has been, how do you keep that link between your destination and your prospective traveler, not to disappear totally in circumstances, but now, as you say, it's even more important to take that space, because otherwise you come to July or September and everyone is communicating to you, then you've lost your pool position. There's an interesting question also on the chat, which asks, from which countries in Europe, and I would enlarge it overall. We know that Asia is very closed at this moment, but from which source markets do you see a rising interest that actually transforms into bookings?
Yeah, I'll give an overview because I can't obviously go into specifics as such, but it doesn't come as a major surprise. It's the markets that actually have created a roadmap out of this pandemic. Every decision as a consumer is making right now is led to a great extent is what's in the media, what politicians are saying, and also what is the health of a given country. in that sense, right? So if you look at what happened with when Boris Johnson announced the roadmap out of the UK, we saw an immediate sort of bounce in terms of the growth in search and booking. So this is, again, and then that's previous to him obviously coming back and sort of pointing out at that later stage that let's not be too hasty and too quick to make the decisions, but that hasn't really slowed down that demand or that search behavior because of that confidence and because of the confidence behind the flexibility and cancellation policies. That's what you're seeing. So it's very much linked to that. So what we have seen, I mean, the Italian market as an example hasn't really ever lost that interest in international travel. Even in the depth of the pandemic, they were, on a fairly even keel in that sense, I wouldn't say 50-50, but probably 60-40 domestic international. So they've been searching for that interest. What's converting are those ones that feel that there is not just a light at the end of the tunnel, but they've been shown the end of the tunnel. And they know that, for example, as of the 17th of May, travel internationally will be possible. So it's more linked to that, that you'll know where that those bookings are coming from, and that's seen in our trends as well. And then also the speed of the vaccination. So we've also seen, recently with the US market in particular, growing in confidence, directly linked to the ramping up of their vaccination program. So the demand from the US market is certainly growing, and what's holding that back is very much obviously the logistical constraints rather than the demand constraints.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think that's two very important points. One, having a roadmap defined, independently of the times, and communicating it to allow for consumers to plan, and also the speed of vaccination. I think two critical points to actually get consumers back on booking. There is another question that links very much to the younger segments that we were discussing before, in terms of being more resilient. I think very much linked in the beginning of the pandemic, and especially during the summer month here in the Northern Hemisphere last year, to the fact that somehow the impact of the disease itself on younger segments was lower. So the risk perception was also influenced by that. But there is a question now connected to, once we return, how do you see, first of all, their capacity or their willingness to travel with a higher risk, with the fact that many of the specific service they would look for during summer might not be available. The question goes like, no summer festivals, no supply that at the end offers what they would expect when they travel.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't know if I've got the answer to that one, because I'm no longer in that age group. But if I'm thinking out loud in terms of, look, we are in a new situation. I think that what we do know about humans is that we are very adaptable. What is not, I would say, it's not so much the reason for travel, but travel is the reason. And I think what you're going to see is people traveling, and they'll take whatever opportunities there are in terms of things to see and do on a trip. The types of trip may be also very different. So longer trips potentially, or multiple trips. That isn't quite defined yet. But we certainly, we could dive into our own data. It's a very good question. I don't know the answer yet too, but I'd love to go and see in our data. Are we seeing multiple trips being booked? Are we seeing longer stay trips being booked? Certainly the sentiment suggests that there's, going to be an acceleration in the work from anywhere type of approach. So people actually, prior to the pandemic, we talked about bleisure as being or bleisure if you're American, but it's this aspect of going for business and adding a bit of leisure. I think there's an element now which, flipping that around, I don't know what the word is, but it'll be going for a leisure trip, but staying longer because you can actually work from that destination. You need your Wi-Fi, and we've all been working from home almost for a year now. So I think there are going to be developments in that area that are key, I would say are key to look at. And obviously around that is, what is the messaging? And I know that in the Middle East, they obviously, I think it was Dubai, also came out with a longer stay type of product, so that people could stay a much longer period of time in a given destination, because they knew that this was going to be a new audience that, and not just in the Middle East, but other parts of the world have done that. I think in Latin America as well, in the Caribbean, encouraging people to stay longer and work from that destination, therefore giving visas which had a longer period. So again, opportunities are there based on consumer trends that are evolving as we speak. But it is very much, as I said, evolving, because things are constantly changing and restrictions are being taken away or put into place. But the reasons for travel are now, I think, not as tangible for festivals. Yes, of course, if you want to go to a festival, you go to a festival, but it's we need to get away, we need to go somewhere. What should we do? Where shall we go?
Thank you, Andy. I think that's a very good point. I think I like very much the holiday is the objective. I think totally right, and I think it will be adjustable. And more than anything else, I think the changes. In the beginning, I was saying, those are trends we're seeing now. We don't know how many of those will be reinforced or changeable. Hopefully, when we're back to different levels of travel facilities, and that's why it's important to keep an eye on the data and to keep as much information to your DMO as possible with all the sources. Also, interesting point, obviously, on the longer stays. There's been many research showing that even not for bigger periods to work from a destination, but that people are tending to extend their stays in the destination a few days. So also an opportunity for destinations to provide information to travelers on what they can do. Because I think that the point here is, telling your prospects what you can actually do in my destination at this point. And I think a lot of that information sometimes is not really available. So I think that's for DMOs a critical point on communicating what you can actually enjoy, maybe beyond the things that you would expect before. And also, obviously, the working from a destination, which is increasing very much. There's another question which I think goes very much in the same line, which says, is there any specific products or segments that would be interesting to consumers at this moment? I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Actually, to add to one of your points as well, I think there's an opportunity now also for DMOs who are looking at their strategies moving forward, is to certainly look at that idea of sustainability, right? So in terms of regional or seasonal spread. So the tendency has been, I guess, in the last period, is for the demand certainly around rural areas, away from crowds, which actually in its own right, if you look at the UK during last summer, it's like everybody was going to the peak districts or to the lake districts where where it became overcrowded. But the point being is, here are opportunities when you start thinking about how to speak to this audience, especially if you're a destination that wants to get better regional spread of that tourism within the country. This is the time really to get that message out, because it's saying, if you're looking at my destination or a similar type of destination, have you thought about this area or that area? So there's that opportunity right now to embed the strategies that they have around sustainability from that context into the messaging that they want to get out to the consumers.
Thank you, Andy. I think that's a key point. I don't think we have, I just have a last question on the chat, which comes to the point when we're talking about younger travelers are more resilient. What age group do you consider when you look into that? Yeah, so
they're grouped into the Z generation right now. So you got the millennials have moved on. They're I'd say, I dare say, almost middle-aged. But you have the millennials, and you have the generation Z, so 23 plus. That's the upcoming. I mean, and then you have younger than that, which is the alpha generation. But I've done a presentation on the alpha generation, and it's the very young ones, sort of born after 2010. So with the advent of the iPad, they are not making the booking themselves, but they have a huge influence on the booking. So these are children and families of millennials. So, you know, more than in my generation for sure, is that those family members, the younger family members, have as equal say in the decision-making process, although it's not them making the final decision. But it's, you know, it's huge. It's up to 80% in terms of a two-way process. So as marketeers, it's incredibly important to understand who they are, and it's a young generation, but they have a huge effect on the destination choice and also what to do.
So watch out for those who were born after 2010,
Yeah.
which, when you think about it, will be less than 21, to actually understand and influence their family's decisions. I think
Absolutely.
that's
I have two of them, and I can tell you it's true, and it's true.
So the evidence is there. Thank you very much, Andy. I think that's a final point, which is critical. You know, we were talking about consumer behavior online, but it's what happens also offline that determines that online behavior. So very much a key point, try to understand your consumers with their families and how the decision-making process takes place. We're run out of time. We reached our 4 o'clock here in Madrid time, and I want to thank everyone that joined us today. I'll tell you that both mine and Andrew's presentation will be available in the UNWTO website, so you can actually go there and have a look at them. You will also be able to re-watch or share the video in our YouTube channel. It will be available soon, so you can actually share it if you're interested. And I would leave, I think, with 3 keynotes. One is don't wait until the demand is there to jump into your activities. Make sure that you keep that conversation going now, and make sure that the communication with the consumers is there, because there will be an overcrowding of messages coming out when we will actually be able to travel again. The second one is, I think, very much what Andy said, communicate about the safety measures, but also make sure that they are being enforced in the destination, and not only communicate about the protocols that are in place. And with a final note, it's good to see that the need and the urgency and the dream is still there. And we are sure that once conditions are there, demand will be coming back again. Thank you so much, Andy. It's been a pleasure to have you on the UNWTO Insights series. All the colleagues around the world as well, good to have you with us. We'll see you in a month's time, again, end of next month, with another invitee talking about data and helping us understand better how to restart tourism, hopefully very, very soon. Thank you once again, Andy. Thank you everyone who joined us. And thank you my colleagues Laura, Michelle, and Tihana in the background, who made our meeting today possible, coordinating for all of us to be here. Thank you everyone, and hope to see you soon.